writing for choral music, as that was more appealing for their audience in their own countries. Many of them worked in the US for lots of years. And then the other issue was writing music for Western instruments and African instruments. So you have the issue of writing a piece where you have written down bits for the Western musicians, and then the African musicians were brought in and they would improvise. So you couldn't write that down for them because they didn't read our notation. And so every time they did the piece, it was different. So you had all of those issues with these new pieces for classical, Western classical audiences. Then there's another composer, Godwin Sado, who's another very important Nigerian scholar and composer. He was nationalistic in his style, including Yoruba and Igbo elements in his works. And there's a young composer that I met called Innocent Ndubuisi Okechukwu, and I've interviewed him online. He's now studying at the Longi School of Music. He was even considering coming here. He writes very beautifully for the voice, with very strong influences from his Igbo language. In fact, he starts from the point of language. And I was going to play something for you today, but because I didn't know who owned the rights to it, I thought it better not to. Another is Timothy Inyoze, who is head of the music department at the University of Ibadan. There are also information and papers about the composers in Ghana, specifically the composer and ethnomusicologist Joseph Hansen Kwabana Inketia, by various writers, and Ephraim Amu by the American professor Felicia Sandler. Now, many of these composers, again, sometimes when you ask for art song in these countries, someone will give you a choral piece. And I said, that's not an art song. So that comes to the question, what is an art song? So an art song is a piece for solo voice and piano. And it's usually set to good poetry, but not always. And it can also be a solo piece without piano accompaniment, but the simple version is a solo piece for voice and piano. Sometimes you can have an art song that is a duet, as in the Mendelssohn duets, or in the Brahms Liebeslieder waltzes, you have 4 people singing, but they're still art songs. There has been a series of papers published excuse me, called Art Music of Caribbean Composers by Christine Gangelhoff, a professor at the University of West Indies, with focus on each of the islands where art music was practiced. Through Christine Gangelhoff, we made contact specifically in the Bahamas through a singer and professor of singing, Joanne Callender, who had professional association with many of the Caribbean composers and was willing, after a few communications, to share that information. She turned out to be a bountiful source of information and connections. She was really lovely. She has a beautiful voice, and she was very, very generous with information and connecting us up to people. We really appreciated that. The composers discovered through this were already established in their area, and in fact well known, if not famous. Franz Hepburn is one who is connected with Britain because he lives here, and you'll hear one of his songs later from a set of 4 songs. In Jamaica, we found Peter Ashborn, who has arranged a lot of instrumental and vocal music. The ones which were most important to this project were 5 songs, a set of 5 Jamaican folk songs. In his background notes and instructions at the beginning of the cycle, he cheekily writes, he offers a word of advice to Jamaicans who are familiar with the original versions of the folk songs. Please learn these songs as new art songs to be learned from scratch. Do not assume you know the song simply because you are familiar with the melody. Learning the song all over again will result in more precision in your execution of the work. For those who are not familiar with the Jamaican patois language, please refer to an informative page by another friend, Alvin Campbell, with advice on how to pronounce unfamiliar words. So there you have it, Jamaicans who don't know this song. Other composers from the Caribbean islands were Timothy Gibson, writer and composer and major figure in the Bahamas. His most famous piece is called Nasa Calling. Edward Clement Bethel, a trained classical pianist and ethnomusicologist who focused his attention on the culture of the Bahamas. His daughter Nicolette, Dr. Nicolette Bethel, continues his work there. Hugh Sam, who was a pianist who also sent me some songs, and Franz Hepburn, whom I've already mentioned, who besides being a composer was a finalist on the television series Opportunity. Do you remember that? We will hear one of his songs later on today. Cleophas Adderley, who has written very beautiful songs and operas, many of which Joanne Callender has sung, and he was a composer and conductor in the Bahamas, but is also known more widely in the US. Some of his songs are published, but much of his oeuvre is still being catalogued by his nephew Ron Adderley. Two of his songs are included in the anthology Art Songs and Spirituals by Contemporary African American Composers, edited by Donna M. Cox and Kathy M. Bullock, who's a dear friend of mine. Another interesting theme of information has come through conversations with academics and composers from South Africa. Thokozani Mlambi, Bongani Indodana Breen, and Nico Villiers, and Chatradari Chats de Vroep. I had the pleasure of online interviews with Thokozani and Bongani, and an online panel discussion with Thokozani, Chats, and Bongani. I also was recently in New York and New Haven. I'm doing some research on Julia Perry, and I remembered that Bongani is a fellow at Yale, and I hadn't realized where I was going was right next to Yale, and so I wrote to him, I said, are you in town? And so we had dinner together, which was really lovely as well, which sort of cements the connection when you actually get to meet people rather than seeing them online. It was really lovely. We discussed how initially classical music training came through mission schools in South Africa, and when they were abolished by the apartheid regime, people had to petition to go to schools, and families would be required to pay very expensive fees for their children to get into those schools. Much of the singing that has developed in South Africa, in the black community anyway, has come through amakwaya. So they took the word choir, spelled it Kwaya, and that was it. And in Koza, which I'll get murdered for pronouncing that way, but anyways, the closest I can come, it's called E-choir. So E means the choir. Anyway, so there are many great singers coming out of South Africa, and there's a long tradition of singing there. They were influenced by the Fisk Jubilee singers, who brought spirituals first to all over the US and to Europe, and they even went to South Africa. So there was something called the Virginia Jubilee Singers, who came from very near where I was brought up in Hampton, Virginia, from the Hampton Institute. And they took spirituals, and the South Africans were very influenced by this. There have been other sources which for now have been less fruitful, which may just take a little more time to develop relationships and harvest information. Other countries explored so far have been Kenya, Ghana, Uganda, and Cameroon. There's still more information to come and more contacts to follow up. I've even received a dissertation on Namibian art song literature, an exploration it's called, from Engelhard Unab, including some of his own songs. Now, you wouldn't think that we were connected to Namibia, but remember, Namibia was a German colony and was taken over by South Africa. So there is an English connection. I think even before that, it had English connections. The songs. We've managed to find some composers who have produced art songs during the targeted period between 1912 and the year of the death of Samuel Coleridge-Taylor and 1990. The approximate beginning of the new generation of black British composers when they were actually practicing. In the UK, there was Avril Coleridge-Taylor, who wrote quite a few songs, one of which was sung on the live stream song recital that we did on Art Song during the COVID lockdown. The other was Amanda Ira Aldrich, the daughter of the great 19th century tragedian, Ira Aldrich. Do you know who he was? He was a great Shakespearean, African-American Shakespearean actor, and was much celebrated in Europe. But most of her songs are popular songs. Both she and Avril Coleridge-Taylor wrote under sobriquet. Aldrich also coached some of the famous African-American artists of the early 20th century, including Paul Robeson, Marian Anderson, and Roland Hayes. Interestingly, her sister, Lurana Aldrich, was engaged at the end of the 19th century to sing at Bayreuth. Unfortunately, because of illness, she couldn't do this. If she had, she would have pipped Grace Bunbury to the post by nearly 100 years. Isn't that extraordinary? It is clear that there are songs extant in archives and private collections, but access to these archives, private collections, and the people who run or own them has been limited or restricted by travel and by just information. Thus far, we have collected a few anthologies, individual songs in some cycles, and a CD recording. So what I've discovered is that working on music by other composers is that if you're going to die as a composer, you really need to have your ducks in a row, because nobody's going to care necessarily when you die that your music is celebrated. And it usually takes somebody 50 to 100 years later to make sure that it is. You have to know who's going to be the heir of the estate, and make sure that someone has continuous access to that succession of heirs, so that your music can be there can be permission to perform your music, permission to publish it, if it's not with a publisher. So there are all sorts of issues that you need to take care of if you're composers, to make sure that your music lives a long time, even if no one's performing it. So even in the archives of British institutions such as the British Library, which holds the songs of Fela Shawande, they were inaccessible, and when reopened, the limited sessions were completely booked for some time. Now that things are more open again, we may have more success, but it still takes time to, well, nobody tells you in research that you have to do life as well. Information from publishing companies has been even harder to access, because publishing companies have been sold oftentimes onto larger companies who are focused on production music and seem to have little interest in answering questions about art songs that no one sings any longer. Meeting the aims of the project. We have started discussions with the research department and library at the RNCM to establish a repository of art songs by Black composers. And this is a contentious word, this Black word. We might say African heritage composers. We've got to find the nomenclature that works for a long time, because I'm not interested in continuing to change it. With a specific emphasis on Black British composers and composers connected with the Commonwealth and former colonial countries. These seem to be the places where the art song by African heritage composers who weren't in the States will have been developed. So there's lots of information happening in the States already. There's lots of research happening in the States already. And I want that included, but I want to specifically focus outside of the States to see what else was happening. We've started to explore the rich theme of music in various countries in the Commonwealth, with particular interest in Nigeria, South Africa, and the Caribbean islands, specifically Jamaica and the Bahamas. There has been some initial analysis, but to date, no detailed analysis of the individual pieces. Nomenclature. The question of nomenclature and association with the British Empire have come up, but not as we expected, i.e. in what to call people Black or not. The discussion has been more centered on the delineation of nationality and various representations of identities with within the constructed nationalities of colonialism. There have been discussions of an international and therefore unified Pan-African Renaissance, which has been developing and gathering momentum for some time now. There seems to be connection with national and regional identity, but also a more general drive to learn the impact of colonialism and nationalism on the Black African diaspora and the development of art and music, or not. This topic has only happened in conversation, some constructed through panels and some just friendly chats. It will take more time and perhaps different research methods to gather any useful data on this area. Creating a resource. The research assistant was working on developing a blog to promote the findings of this research and to future projects resulting from the work we've done so far. We have to continue working on that. Again, that takes time. There are repositories already in the US, but what I would like is for the RNCM to have a Europe-wide repository where we're a place where people come for this information. So we have research documents and we have the scores where people can find them. And other outcomes are the lecture that I gave last week called Darmstadt and African Heritage Composers. A competition which I established here called the Williams Howard Prize to promote the study and performance of art songs by African heritage composers, and we just had the first competition on the 13th of March, and the winners of the competition, the first and second prize winners, will have a recital at the Buxton Festival in the summer, in July. And we've started competitions about a festival of black classical music at the RNCM. And I hope one day, eventually, people don't tell you that research takes time out of your life, that I will have an anthology of art songs by Black, British and African American composers. And that will probably extend beyond Black, British and African American composers, because we, again, have to sort out that nomenclature. I've participated in online discussions with South African academics and scholars about things I didn't know about, and had an interesting conversation anyway. I find this quite often, that I go into these conversations, these highfalutin conversations, and I'm thinking, what will I have to say? But you have a conversation anyway because you have questions. And I think that's the most important thing, is to have questions. And I've been invited to various conferences online and invited to be a judge in various competitions as a result of this work. And working very closely with my friend, Dr. Louise Toppin from the University of Michigan, who's very, very important in the study of African American and African diaspora music. And she set up something called the African Diaspora Project at the University of Michigan. It's an online thing where she has loads and loads of scores and information, and if people want it, they can donate something to the African Diaspora Project and get the scores from her. And we've just made lots of contacts and connections, and for me that's the most important thing, is learning and connecting with people and finding out more about things beyond what we know, so that we can make the canon more complete. The questions that have arisen are, what are the reasons that encourage the art song development in some countries and not in others? What is the relevance of the art song outside of the European concert hall and parlor? And more specifically, what is its significance in the Black African diaspora? Is there a reason? Because if you look beyond the conservatoires and the recital halls, the art song really has very little significance in our own culture, but we daren't say that because we live on it. Is there a reason for the prevalence of the art song composition in the African American and perhaps even Caribbean islands as opposed to African countries? What were the sociological conditions that produced a more conducive environment for the propagation of this form? What is an art song in the Black African diaspora? Does it translate differently in various countries? Does the form stay the same? Is the art song always the art song as we know it in European culture when it is then translated to various Black African cultures? Is the art song even relevant anymore? In the US and Britain, there are programs and competitions dedicated to the promotion and propagation of art songs. There are even specific mentoring programs and competitions aimed at promoting art songs by Black composers. Does this extend to the Commonwealth? What are the most useful ways to find this information that can sometimes be forgotten, presumed lost, and sometimes considered of little importance to the cultural heritage of the country or surviving family of the composer, and or little significance to the little significance to the output over of the composer, because the composer may have done lots of other things besides art song, and this is just a tiny bit they've done. The effects of the pandemic on research have not dampened our enthusiasm or interest in the subject. It is a project that will continue over a longer period and take more time to develop relationships. And my final thing to say is that for me, it's important that students after me don't have the same answer that I had from my professor. That the canon becomes more inclusive, and so I call it exploding the canon, not so that it falls apart, but so it makes room for other things that are useful, other things that are interesting, and other things that are beautiful. You know, in the competition, people were going, oh my God, that's extraordinary, that's a beautiful song. And I said, and that's just that much of it. There is so much music there. So now I'm going to stop droning on, and I'm going to introduce you to my young students and students from other people's studios who are going to be singing today. And I think Barbara has some programs for you. And Barbara, may I have one just so I can introduce the singers? So, and some people will say something about their songs. I can speak about your song if you'd like me to. Would you like that? Okay. Okay. So, the first song is going to be In Como, that looks like Lin Como, but it's In Como Zifile, which means the cows are dead. Well, that's what it means. And E, double E means plural. Yes, it means the, but these, the, plural. Hear Me, and that's by Bongani Indodana Breen. The second one is Hear Me by Dominique Legendre. The third is two songs, Violin and My Heart is Awake. The fourth one is Sweet Lass on the Well by, that's Maria Thompson-Cauley. The third one, Violin and My Heart is Awake. Sweet Lass on the Well is by Richard Thompson. Whatever is from a set of four words by Franz Hepburn. And this is, the first word is no, the second word is why, the fourth word is whatever, and the third word is whatever, and the fourth word is yes. And yes is quite difficult, isn't it? And the last song is by Peter Ashborn from the 5 songs, the ones for which he gave such detailed instructions. And this is called Long Time Gal, and it has a bit of patois in it. So the singers today are German Young baritone, and his pianist is Mariko Ishiyama, and Bonnie Callahan soprano, Lucy Fairman soprano, Ella Joy soprano, and then Bonnie singing again, and then Brennan Aline tenor, and they will all be accompanied by Young Shin Shon Ong. I hope I got that right. Okay, so singers. The lid just a little bit to show a bit more encouragement. Put it on a short stick. How do we get this short stick? Do you push it?
My father's cattle song. We're going to perform together Violin and My Heart is Awake by Maria Thompson-Cauley. As you can see on the programme, Maria is a Canadian composer, she's also a pianist, and these songs are part of a song cycle of 10 songs altogether, composed in 2018. The first one, we had a nice email conversation. She was really willing to give me information on how these pieces should be sung. So the first one isn't actually about a violin, it's about a person who she's in love with, and the love is unrequited, and you can tell that it's like a dream-like state, especially with like the held piano and the chords at the start, and then it becomes more clear where she says, this person isn't mine, and it's almost like a reality. And the second piece, My Heart is Awake, she described as a fleeting thought, that's why it's quite excited, and then that also settles and you're reflecting upon that thought. So I hope that gives you more of an understanding before we perform it.
Oh, So as Michael explained earlier, the song that I'm going to sing is quite heavy on patois. So just a brief explanation in case you're not familiar with the sounds that you're going to be hearing. Essentially this song is greeting someone dear to me that I haven't seen in long enough for the famous John Crow in Jamaica, if you're familiar with Jamaican culture. The John Crow often signifies death. It's essentially just a very extreme way of saying it's been so long since I've seen you that the crows have come to eat my corpse because I died. So yeah. This long time girl, me never see you. Come make me hold your hand. This long time girl, me never see you. Come make me hold your hand. He'll head John Cross, sit on the treetop, pick off the blossom. Make me hold your hand, girl. Make me hold your hand. This long time girl, me never see you. Come make we walk and talk. This long time girl, me never see you. Come make we walk and talk. He'll head John Cross, sit down in a treetop, pick off the blossom. Make me hold your hand, girl. Make me hold your hand. This long time girl, make me walk and talk. Long time girl, this long time girl, this long time girl, this long time girl, me never see you. This long time girl, me never see you. Come make we wheel and turn. This long time girl, me never see you. Come make we wheel and turn. He'll head John Cross, sit down in a treetop, pick up the blossom. Make me hold your hand, girl. Make me hold your hand. Make me hold your hand, girl. Come make me hold your hand. Make we wheel and turn till we tumble down. Make we wheel and turn, girl. Make we wheel and turn till we tumble down. Make me hold your hand, girl. Make we wheel and turn till we tumble down. Make me hold your hand, girl. Make we wheel and turn till we tumble down. Make me hold your hand, girl.
Give the students another round of applause, please. Thank you to all of the students and the singers and pianists. They really came together at the last minute to do this. I really, really appreciate your work. Thank you very much. That's a drink in the bar somewhere. Barbara, do you want to take over?
Yeah. Is there another? Are we doing the video or is that not?
Are we doing the? Oh no.
No, that's not happening then.
No, we're not going to do the
No,
video
that's
because
great.
that was
Okay.
copyright. Thank you all
Wonderful.
for coming, Barbara.
This fantastic. It's brilliant to bring these songs to life and to hear them and the range and variety of them. I loved that last one actually. It was really brilliant, beautifully interpreted. But all of you really, really fantastic. And I think the whole business of finding, and you were talking about exploding the canon, it's about challenging the canon in order to grow the repertoire, isn't it?
That's right.
So this is a repertoire. We want this repository at the RNCM to be a resource so that students and everyone really, much well beyond these walls, can access this music. And it's a huge amount of work. And hearing about the relationships and networks of composers of academics. I like the way you keep talking about research and having a life. I think that's it. I'm too far gone. Certainly in my case, there's not so much life left. But it's important work. It's vital work, and maybe in turn you can all look to see what's missing. In some ways, we need to look around. Who's been forgotten? Why they've been forgotten? And it's not about legit music. I think that's fantastic. I mean, it's shocking in some ways. I remember when I was doing my doctorate, I worked on so-called second-rate composer, and I think attitudes, even in the past 10, 20 years and very recently, have changed massively. We're not just interested in the composers who've been handing down. We are very interested in them, but there's so many people who have been forgotten for all sorts of reasons, and it's sort of our duty as musicians and as scholars to see what might have been forgotten and to try and bring it to attention of performers and of people who are concert goers and people who are interested. So fantastic work. Michael, really interesting presentation and huge amount of work to get to this point. And it's an ongoing project, isn't it?
It is, yes.
I think you've got the bug for doing this sort of thing, and it's so I wonder if we have any questions from anyone. I don't know whether you might have questions to ask about the music you've been performing, or anyone who's been listening.
I was just going to ask, will this music be available in the library? Will some be
Well, some of it is. We're working on that. We're working on getting the music in the library, so that's part of the whole. And I understand that we may have a donation for already to start the repository, so maybe from the school, but
Fantastic.
we hope that we have some money for that already. And I will work to find more funding for it, because I think it's really important.
Well, we're
working together,
because
and
the
Barbara's a
research
huge
department.
support. I mean, she's been absolutely fantastic. I mean, Professor Kelly. No, Barbara's been really, really great in supporting me through this project and encouraging me, so I really, really appreciate that.
Well, I think it's everyone who takes part in this venture, but it'd be great to see it to the next step, and brilliant that the prize is up and running. It's had one round, and hopefully that will.
It'll continue. It's already set up. It's established to continue. Has the funding already, so.
Exactly, and the importance of funding for all these things is vital. Okay, so any more questions? There's something in the chat. I've had to monitor the Zoom room as we've been.
I just wanted to say that the poetry is important in this as well, and Maria Thompson-Cauley writes her own poetry, so she's a poet author. She's I was trying to think of a word for a Renaissance woman who does everything. That's Maria.
A Renaissance woman.
And the interesting thing about Richard Thompson, this ballad, it was a Scottish ballad. You'll be interested to know. And this guy, Rudy Clear, who's maybe Jamaican as well, because I met Richard in California at the African American Arts Song Alliance, and he said to me, he said, "Oh, hello," in this very Scottish accent. I can't do it, but he says, "I'm from Aberdeen," and I'm like, "You're from Aberdeen, dude." And he's Jamaican heritage, but he was born in Aberdeen, and he still speaks with a bit of a lilt, Scottish lilt. And he said that Rudy grew up and they learned Scottish ballads all the time, so he wrote the Scottish ballad, and then Richard sat it in that way because they're both, he has the Scottish heritage. So it's really, really interesting.
How heritages come together.
Yes, come together, and
exactly.
you can't, stop things sort of melding. So it's not about appropriation, but joining together. And as long as people acknowledge where things come from and respect those things, there's no problem with music. Is universal. Music is universal.
It is.
Yeah.
But there's probably a but in terms of just because we often speak about in those terms, and yet it also is specific as well, in that it suggests different traditions and different ways of communicating. And I guess these songs sort of show that, don't they?
That's
they
right,
show the
that's
way
right.
in which it covers such a wide range around the world.
That's right,
and,
that's right.
And all those influences.
And I think it's just about being sensitive to cultural specificities, being sensitive to those things and making sure that when you are performing a piece, that you recognize the things that you can do and that you can't do, that you shouldn't do, or maybe you should consider asking whether it's okay for you to do it, if that makes sense. because there's so many historical facts that you have to consider, especially when approaching this kind of music.
Well, I was just going to say that similar to when I was doing the Williams Howard, I was singing the spiritual, and
It was
obviously,
wonderful.
and obviously as someone who's not of African heritage, it's so important to, like you just said, perform this music, but make sure you are being appropriate and you're showcasing this work in the right way. So I asked Michael, I think if people have any, they don't approach these works because they're worried about maybe not going about it in the right way. It's always best to ask and use.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a wonderful book by Gene Snyder on Harry T. Burleigh, who was one of the, he was probably one of the preeminent American art song composers of the turn of the century. He also taught Dvorak about African American music and spirituals, and which led to the Symphony of the New World. He also was an editor for recording, and he set Deep River in 1916, 1917, and was probably, along with Samuel Coleridge-Taylor, the inspiration for a lot of African heritage composers. And at the he set Deep River, but a lot of African American singers at that time didn't necessarily want to sing this repertoire because it reminded them of the time. It wasn't that far since enslavement had finished, and we were in the middle of post-Reconstruction when after the war, the Civil War, people had success, and then the Ku Klux Klan came to prominence again. And there were lynchings all the time. So people didn't necessarily want to associate with this music. So a lot of white European singers sang spirituals as well on the concert stage. And many in the 1917 season that Gene Snyder talks about in her book, there were many people who performed Harry T. Burleigh songs, not just the spirituals, but also his art songs. And these were great singers, the greatest singers in the country, singing his music.
I think the fact that you approach the composer, the Canadian composer, is a really interesting point. And that if you don't know something, because we are not expected to, in a sense, to know everything, but making that connection yourself is a really interesting thing to do. And
it's rare to be able to speak to a composer of a piece you're performing, so that was really nice.
And most of these composers were of the later, or living composers now. So they weren't from that period because the most of the things that I had from that period were on videos, and I didn't know who owned the rights to them, so I didn't perform them.
That makes sense.
That's why there was no performance of people from that period that we were talking about.
Okay, because it's...
And because the scores are either unavailable or I didn't have permission to play the videos.
Okay.
That's why.
But there's lots more, and that's the important message.
There's lots more.
I've had a couple of comments coming in on the chat and managed to check. I'm looking at the number. They're all coming in now. Adam Swain says, "This was a fantastic talk and performance. Thank you, Michael, and to all the musicians. I love the definition of exploding the canon, and also love that there are already so many tangible benefits for the RNCM community. Bravo."
Oh, thank you, Adam.
And then Ava writes, "Thank you all, Michael and performers. What a delight. Really great to think that the far-reaching benefits a repository such as this could have in influencing music making outside the RNCM too." And Adam is showing his face, which is even nicer.
Hi, Adam.
Adam, do you want to ask anything else? No? Just waving at everyone. It's lovely to see you. And I agree with both Adam and Ava in their comments. So any final comments? Anna?
Yes, Michael, I just wanted to ask if you've had any contact with Willard White.
I haven't. He used to be the president of the country. I haven't yet, no, but
I was just wondering how someone of his Jamaican, isn't he?
Yes, he's Jamaican.
His Jamaican upbringing, what it would be interesting to know what sort of his experience or his standpoint was on in fact whether whether he was taught any or whether it was all.
Well, I think the islands of the Caribbean have their own music, so it's not. So Maria, for instance, her mother was from Bermuda and her father was Jamaican. I think that's the right order. And they then lived in some outlying county which was very cold. I go, how did you manage it? In this cold place in Canada, and that's where she grew up. So her connection wasn't specifically with her culture, but there were a few people in her community who were from similar Caribbean, but not many. So that wasn't her upbringing. So, but she went to the States and she taught at historically African American, historically Black College and University, HBCU, and at Florida A&M. And so she basically got her training through that and through her own family. You know. Yeah, so it's not that you're always brought up in it, but you might have some distant connection with it, and you learn that way.
Fantastic. Great. So Adam said he would like to have said more, but he has no voice. So we'll respect that. I understand. But thank you to all for attending. And we had some visitors from the Netherlands here, who were
nice.
from the Conservatoire and University in Amsterdam and Utrecht. I
Right.
met them at lunchtime, and they all came. So they're coming to the opera tonight too. So that's really good. And they were interested in the sort of way in which we bring performance and research together. And this is a really nice example of it.
Oh, nice.
So, yes?
I'd just like to say thanks to Michael for organising this, because I must say before this I did not have much repertoire, in my portfolio of these composers, and as a result I've discovered so much music that I would never have it's a bit of a shame to say that, but probably wouldn't have discovered otherwise. So thank you to Michael for that.
Here.
Everybody for coming today, and I hope you will explore. That's what's important after, is that you will explore. And thank you for all of your support.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye. This room is going to be turned into something for the pre-opera event.
Okay.
So we are being asked to...
Fantastic job, everybody. Thank you so much. Really, really fantastic.
Writing
I'm reading poetry or something. Oh, did you have a good job? Very nice. It was such a wonderful experience, really. Thank you very much. We really love it, and thank you very much.
I'm impressed with myself. Okay.
I was impressed. You can't take it. Yeah. Thank you very much for supporting him as well.
Yeah.
Okay, see you later. Bye. What did you all think?